Thanks for coming along with us once again. We are joined, as always, by Greg Engert, beer director for the Neighborhood Restaurant Group, a James Beard Award nominee. The group includes Vermilion in Old Town, also Rustico, of course, 2 locations, Alexandria and Ballston. Greg, it is always good to see you.
See you too.
What do we have on tap this week?
One, yeah, this is definitely
visually appealing.
Yeah, it's cool. It's got a kind of cranberry juice quality to it, color. This is a somewhat new, a resuscitated beer from New Belgium Brewing out of Fort Collins, Colorado. It's called Transatlantique Kriek. They first did a batch of this back in 2003, and their Lips of Faith series sends us a couple rare beers, throughout the year, 2 at a time. This is the most recent, and they like to sometimes go back and revive old styles, which is cool. And this one's a collaboration and a transatlantic collaboration. So, and one of the, I don't know of anything else that's quite done like this. A lot of this beer is actually shipped from Belgium on its own and then blended with the New Belgium beer to create this beer. So it starts its life at Boon Brewerij in Lambiek in Belgium near Brussels. And this is operated by Frank Boon, who is one of the revivalist Lambiek producers and blenders. And Lambiek's, of course, spontaneously fermented beer that literally rely on wild yeast and ale yeast and bacteria around us to ferment the beer naturally and spontaneously, giving you kind of funky, earthy, somewhat sour flavors. Frank makes a batch of spontaneously fermented beer. He places it into oak barrels where it matures for about 2 years. And towards the end of that maturation, he adds in a nice healthy dose of Polish cherries. And that's, of course, what stains the beer, this kind of reddish tone and hue. And then he lets it age further in the oak. Typically, he would then blend and produce his Boon Kriek from this, Kriek meaning cherry in Flemish. But in this case, he takes some of that 2-year-old oak-aged, spontaneously fermented, sour, funky beer that has cherries in it at this point, ships it to Fort Collins, Colorado, where Peter Bruckart is waiting, and he's the brewmaster for New Belgium. He used to be the brewmaster at Rodenbach, so he knows a thing or two about sours, of course, in Belgium, the home of the famous Flemish red ale. And so what they thought was they wanted to brew a beer to blend with this, and what they decided to do was to brew a kind of malty, stronger pale lager. And so New Belgium brews a malty, stronger pale lager, and then they take that brew and blend it with the Boon Kriek, Lambiek, and then that's the Transatlantic Kriek is.
So this is, the beer is shipped over from Belgium. They brew the beer, as you mentioned, and what is the blending process involved? Is it just simple of deciding we're going to go 60-40 or 50-50 and they just dump it together? Is it that rudimentary?
It's that rudimentary. There's different ways with pipettes and things like that to come up with different blends and taste test and things like that. It's what winemakers do and what a lot of blenders do. And then you come up with your blend ratios, and then you blend them into stainless steel tanks, and then you carbonate, and then you keg and bottle.
So before we taste it, what sort of flavors are we?
Should we be expecting? It's a good question.
Here?
First off, I always like to talk about when you hear Lambiek or Lambic, most people associate that with sweeter lambics and these are things like from Lindemans, like Lindemans Framboise and things like that. Because, Lambic has been around in one way or another since the 1400s, if not a little bit earlier. And in the 19th and then the 20th century, tastes shifted away to cleaner, mass-produced kind of pilsners that were a little bit sweeter, not as sour and funky as these beers had become. So breweries like Lindemans and many others, Cantillon did it too, until the 70s, they were making sweet Lambic as well, had to start filtering, pasteurizing their beers to kill off the wild yeast and bacteria, and then adding sweeteners and fruit juices and syrups to come up with a beer that was more palatable to the masses. And that's why Lindemans Framboise is as famous as it is today and things like that. But that is very, very modern, and that's the kind of modern sweet Lambic. There are brewers, of course, still making traditional Lambics, breweries like Cantillon and Dre Fontaine and Hansen's as a blender. We have new ones like Decam and Tilkin. They're making classic Lambic without filtration, without pasteurization, without sweetening. Boon is making traditional Lambic, but his palate goes for a milder Lambic. His aren't as funky and wild as Cantillon, for instance. So already, now this isn't going to be sweet and sugary like Lindemans can be, but it's not going to be as wild and funky as Cantillon on its own. And then when we blend in the lager, we're kind of cleaning it up and making it crisper and more refreshing. So you'll have some cherry tartness, you'll have some funk, but it almost will maybe be more like, in some ways, kind of a stronger Berliner Weiss with cherry added to it, or even more akin to like a Flemish red ale or something like that.
All right.
Let's try it out.
Slight tart aroma, but not anything overpowering.
Nope. And then just a mild acidity on the palate, very juicy, very cherry forward.
That is really,
It's tasty.
really tasty.
Yeah, it's good.
And cherries are probably my least favorite fruit, but I'm happy to drink them.
Yeah, it's almost
although
like a black
the
cherry.
taste is not overpowering.
No,
it's not a
mild.
fruity or overly sweet, as you said, taste.
Yeah, it's definitely restrained. And again, as seems to be the case a lot with New Belgium beers, this is 8% alcohol.
Okay.
It doesn't taste like it at all. It tastes like it's maybe 3% alcohol. I mean, it tastes really juicy and clean and crisp and refreshing. It's kind of like when we were talking about like tart lychee. Same thing. How deliciously fresh and vibrant that was, and that was almost 8% as well. It just doesn't taste like it, you know. So
I wanted to ask about the process of adding the cherries, and you mentioned cherry juice. Are the cherries involved in the beer in Belgium as strictly a flavoring agent, or do they play any role in the maturation or fermentation process?
it's flavoring, but it will ferment. I mean, so in the case of the sweet lambics, they're typically adding sweeteners, sugars and sweeteners after pasteurization, so that they won't keep getting fermented because there's no yeast left to ferment. Or they're adding cherry juice and things like that. In the case of traditional lambic, you've got spontaneously fermented beer that's been placed in oak barrels. Now, there's wild yeast and bacteria sitting in the oak as well, so that continues to ferment wildly. When you then add in whole Polish cherries, in the old days they added something called skarbica cherries, which were the classic cherries that grew in and around Brussels. As the area is urbanized so much, we don't think of it as farmland quite as much anymore, and the skarbica has kind of gone away, and it's just cheaper to import Polish cherries, for instance. But a lot of people don't realize that the soil in and around Brussels is beautiful for agriculture. And so that's one of the reasons why cherries ended up getting in there. But they would be added in for flavoring. But you add in the whole cherry, and what happens with lambic is the wild yeast and bacteria will consume a lot of the sugars of the cherry. So it's not necessarily as sweet and cherryish as you might expect. And the pits go in as well, and that's said to impart a kind of nuttiness to the beer.
I normally turn my nose up at Kriek-style
Sweeter
beers,
yeah.
but this, honestly, this is
it's tasty. And like Cantillon Kriek is funky and wild and dry and delicious, and not what you think about. It doesn't taste like cherries hardly at all. It smells of cherries. Hansen's makes a Kriek that is wonderful. Dre Fontainen does as well, and Dre Fontainen makes a Kriek every so often that's made entirely with skarbica cherries. Those old kind of cherry that's really delicious. They're very small and they're pretty sour. One of the reasons why they fell by the wayside is that they're so small that they're not easily harvested by machinery. Okay. A bigger, plumper cherry is more easily harvested, so it's harder to use scarbicas, but they're delicious.
You can turn your nose up at beer sometime, but that doesn't mean you can not keep trying something you may not always like on occasion, because we are lucky to live in an age where the tide just keeps rolling in with
new all the time.
with great beers. And before I forget, must be some fun pairing ideas with this.
Oh yeah, this is one of those ones that can go just like anywhere. I mean, I love this just to start aperitif kind of thing. It leads well into first courses. You can do it with raw fish. You can do it with shellfish. Obviously, it's got that cool acidity, balancing brine. Do it with any kind of salad. It's a sort of vinaigrette that you add onto the salad. Then towards the end of the dish, I mean, you can also do it with anything that goes great with cherries. You think like duck breast, duck confit, pork. Be awesome with this. And then towards the end, now you can bring it back for dessert too. I mean, you can do it with chocolate desserts to add some fruit. Just a bowl of vanilla ice cream would be fantastic.
Real quick before we go, I'm asking a lot of goofy questions today, but when you take the beer New Belgium made and you take the beer that Boon made, and you mix them together, one's one ABV, I assume, the other's another ABV. What do you wind up with when you mix the two together?
Well, it's a good question because I don't know the exact blend. I don't know what the percentage is. I don't know exactly what it is, but it's quite interesting because Boon lambics on their own are not that strong. And so to your point, if there's a lot of Boon Lambic in there, and it's still 8%, that means the base lager beer has got to be really, really strong. So it's a good question, and maybe one that New Belgium will answer for us, so we can get back to you.
Send us some of the lagers by itself.
Yeah, exactly.
If you've got a question for Greg, send us an email at beeroftheweek@wtop.com. Greg, thank you as always.
Thank you.
Everyone, please always do drink responsibly, and be sure to bring your thirst next time for another Beer of the Week.